I wonder if Ed is watching.
Welcome, everyone. We will get started in just a minute. So for all of you who are joining, we're going to get started in just a few minutes. I'd encourage you in the meantime to set your chat window up so that you can type questions to our panelists during the presentation. Welcome, everyone. I'm going to let more people join for about a minute, and then we'll get started this afternoon. Well, good afternoon. I think we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Hadley German, and I am the Eugene B. Adkins Curator here at the Fred Jones Jr. Museum of Art. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to our first Zoom program held in conjunction with the exhibition OKLA. First, as a bit of housekeeping, we have muted all of our attendees' microphones, but we encourage all of you to type questions or comments into the chat box on Zoom. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the program for our panelists to respond to your questions, but you can type questions or comments throughout the program. Now, I'm pleased to introduce you to the two special guests we have on hand today. Born and raised in Oklahoma City, Paul Ruscha moved to Hollywood, California in 1963, where he worked at the LA County Museum of Art and attended Chouinard Art Institute, focusing on lettering and calligraphy. His first two exhibitions were held at the Contemporary Art Foundation in Oklahoma City in 1969 and 1973. And since then, Paul has worked as a conceptual artist, as a photographer for multiple magazines, and as a studio manager and photographer for his brother, the artist Ed Ruscha. We're especially honored to have Paul with us here today. Dr. Mark White needs almost no introduction in these parts. Currently the executive director of the New Mexico Museum of Art in Santa Fe, he previously served as the Wiley Dean and Bill Saxon director here at the FJJMA. His exhibitions and associated publications include A World Unconquered, The Art of Oscar Brous Jacobson, Macrocosm, Microcosm, Abstract Expressionism in the American Southwest, and Art Interrupted, Advancing American Art and the Politics of Cultural Diplomacy. Most recently, Dr. White has curated the current exhibition, OKLA, which brings us together today. Please join me in a warm Zoom welcome for Mark White and Paul Ruscha.
Well, thank you, Hadley. That was a very nice introduction. And I want to thank Hadley as well as Byron Price and the rest of the staff at the Fred Jones Jr. Museum of Art for having me here, as well as Paul.
Mm-hmm. And I want to thank Hadley for looking like Dakota Johnson. There she is.
Got the way for that. All right. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. It's really a pleasure for Paul and I to be here to talk about the exhibition OKLA, which actually originated as a conversation between the two of us. Paul, you want to relay your memory of that conversation?
Yeah, we were talking about the guys that moved from Oklahoma City to LA, and I had mentioned that 60 years, actually it was 59 years before, had their first show at the Oklahoma Art Center, which was in the fairgrounds in Oklahoma City. And it was their very first show. It was Joe Goode and Ed Ruscha and Jerry McMillan and Pat Blackwell. And I went to the opening, and it was great. It's nice to see a few of the images from that show, because those paintings are lost. Who knows where they are now. But anyway, it was Mark and I started talking about it, and I said it'd be neat to have a show, like an anniversary show of that first show of 60 years before. And so they brought it together, and this year, the 60th anniversary, they decided to unveil the show. And then Mark said that I should join the show as well as Mason Williams, because we were both connected to those guys, and we were all sort of in pursuit of our own directions in art, and so we agreed, and the result is our little postpartum downstairs.
Well, it was actually a real pleasure to work with Paul and all the artists on the exhibition, and it was very important to me that we examined the show from the standpoint of these lifelong relationships, as well as the way in which the show dealt with their past in Oklahoma and its lingering impact on their careers, as well as their ongoing careers in Los Angeles or wherever they have wound up now. Mason Williams is in Oregon, Pat Blackwell is in Massachusetts. But the show is in very much a biography of these six individuals and their life in art. And while I served as curator for the show, in many ways, they had a lot of influence on the objects that were chosen and the perspective that we took on the show. So to that end, let's go ahead and move into the exhibition. You can see the title wall there, OKLA, which is a combination of a work by Patrick Blackwell and Jerry McMillan. And to that end, we want to start by talking about a piece of Patrick Blackwell's, the untitled print Matches from 1972. Pat is sort of an interesting artist in the context of this group. He attended the Chouinard Art Institute with Joe Goode, Jerry McMillan, and Ed Ruscha, and however, took a different path professionally than the other three because he decided to go into advertising. And so Pat gets a job initially at the prestigious design firm Carson Roberts, and he's there in the 60s, actually working alongside Ed Ruscha. Ed was for a brief time in the design field. And then ultimately, Pat will leave with his wife at the time and move to New York City, where he begins working at the advertising firm Dane Doyle Bernbach. This print Matches from 1972 dates from that time period. And I think what's great about it is that on one hand, it really is just an image of the mundane aspect of the matchbook. And even as an advertising director, he doesn't really focus on the cover of the matchbook. And just as a contrast, I would throw in Joe Goode's Be American from 1961, where the cover of that matchbook really is his focus. But Pat just wants to give us a kind of serial repetition, the sort of mundane aspect of everyday life. And this is what a lot of Pat's artistic work is like. Paul, would you want to talk a little bit about your memories of Pat?
Yeah. One thing I like about this print is that it's a repetition of a repetition of a repetition. He's got these matches, which are all like tear outs. And then he's got them all set up like in these rows, and they're not perfect. I like the fact they're not perfect. They're a little off center and a little dropped. And anyway, I didn't know Pat that well. I'd only met him a few times, but what I loved about Pat was he had great laughing eyes, and his laugh was just second to none. He just had the funniest, most robust laugh I think I'd ever heard. And it was more fun making him laugh than anything else. But it was great. And then I kind of look at this like I did with the Joe Goode work, which is what you showed right after this, Mark. And it was because it was also matches, and the key word in that, is it possible to bring that up, Mark?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, you see the key words in that to me, besides Be American, Buy American, was close cover for safety. and then those pieces of torn, it looks almost like wood, but I think it is just paper.
It's just paper.
With, paint on the side of it. And that's very Joe-like, the torn works, that he did later on remind me of this. But I really love this little piece, and it's a nice compliment to the work that Pat had done.
And it's worth noting that a lot of almost all of the artists in the show experimented with found objects a lot, including yourself, Paul. I mean, right. You still really work with found objects in many ways, apart from your work as a photographer. Mm-hmm. And I think this work by Joe, and I would say that it applies to some degree to Pat's work, they often look to the objects of everyday experience, but also the work didn't necessarily have to last. In fact, I mean, there were numerous works that Joe and Ed in particular created at the Chouinard Art Institute that were never intended to last. That's right. So it's kind of useful to note that, and I would second what Paul said. Pat has to be one of the nicest, most genuine human beings I've ever met in my life. And one of the pleasures of curating this show was getting to know Pat. And he may be watching today, and I hope so. And if you are, hi, Pat.
Yeah.
Great to see you.
Yeah, he's great.
Well, we're going to move through the show again, and this time stop on a work by Joe Goode, specifically the drawing Lion. And Joe came to use the tornado as a motif in the late 80s. And as he tells it, it was because he bought a book at the airport, which I believe, although I can't confirm, was Gary England's Those Darn Twisters, which was a sort of case-by-case history of some of the most destructive tornadoes in Oklahoma history. I don't have to tell probably most of you watching that Oklahoma has been identified with tornadoes for decades now. But Joe has always been interested in natural phenomenon, meteorology. So it makes sense, being a native Oklahoman himself, that he would look to the tornado as a motif. But the way that he did it is interesting because in many ways, an object like this owes more to Japanese ink painting than it does to anything that would have come out of Oklahoma. Joe was producing these works in sumi ink, Japanese ink, on washi paper. So, both of the materials are very Japanese. And the paper in this case was being made by Joe's wife, Hiromi Katayama. And so there is this sort of interesting meeting of East and West in these particular pieces. Paul, what are your thoughts on the tornado?
Well, I love these tornado paintings and drawings that Joe did, a whole series of them. And I, I, had one for many years until I just bequeathed it to the Fred Jones Museum. And what I loved about that painting was that it was almost a tornado in itself, because the paint kept dripping off of it onto the frame. And it was very much like tornadoes are. You can never predict them. And I love the abstract sense of Joe's tornadoes, and he does just beautiful abstracts in a very representational way.
Well, I think Paul. Oh, I'm sorry, Paul. Go ahead.
This is definitely one of my favorites of that series. And yes, the ink and the paper and everything that he has used, it just adds to the beauty of what is a very dangerous occurrence of Mother Nature.
Yeah, I would agree with you completely. He really did find a way to make something aesthetically beautiful out of something very destructive. Mm-hmm. And the point you make about chaos is a really interesting one, because there's a serious element of chance to what Joe's doing here. I mean, he has an idea as to what he wants the form to look like, but the thing about Japanese ink wash painting is that the ink is going to seep. It's going to move on its own, and often Joe wouldn't really know what the effect was going to be until the next day. And so there is an element of chance, just like the tornado in many of these drawings. You don't know exactly what's going to happen.
Yeah, gosh, this is great.
How did you get to meet Joe originally, Paul?
He and his brother Dick they were altar boys at our church, St. Francis of Assisi in Oklahoma City, and they were able to be altar boys, and Ed and I were not. So we envied them for that, but later on they ended up where they were in school. Dick's a little bit older than I am, and Joe is a little bit older than Ed, but they were in school together, and I believe Dick and Joe and Ed were in a fraternity, a high school fraternity called Alpha Omega Pi, and so they knew each other as growing boys and then growing men, because Ed went to California with Mason, and then Joe followed them, and Jerry McMillan, and it was great. They sort of lured one another to the West Coast and to the life they have led till today.
Jerry tells an interesting story about that fraternity. I guess when he and Joe were initiated, or maybe it's not Joe, maybe it was somebody else, but it might have been Joe. But when he was initiated into that fraternity, there was a little bit of hazing that went on. So they took him out in the middle of nowhere and made him walk back. But as part of that, they had to eat a bunch of Limburger cheese.
Oh, okay.
And Jerry realized that he actually really liked Limburger cheese.
Most probably.
And so, he will eat that to this day.
I remember when Ed was being hazed, at one point, my mother and I were going downtown. Mother didn't tell me why, but I saw why when we got down there, because in front of the drugstore, I think it was VZ Drugs, was Ed, and he was like handing out rolls, pieces of toilet paper off of a toilet paper roll. And I thought, Mom, what's the deal here? What's Ed doing? And she was amused, but I don't know that it surprised her. I think she might have known about it beforehand, but that was part of Ed's hazing.
Were people taking the toilet paper from him?
Yes, we did.
Okay.
I probably used it.
Well,
Ed, I think, ended up as the last, before they banned high school fraternities, Ed was the last president of the fraternity. Oh, this is great.
well, speaking of Jerry McMillan and Joe Goode, the next work that we want to talk about is War Babies from 1961. And I won't tell the full story, but I'll at least introduce it. So what you see here is the poster, and that's the way that most people know this image. It was an advertisement for an exhibition in 1961 titled War Babies. And it was a group show with 4 artists. In this case, you have Ed Bareel on the left. You have Larry Bell to his left. Then you have Joe Goode. And then you have Ron Mishimuro. And so, Paul, do you want to tell the story about the photograph, which is actually in the exhibition, and then the poster as well?
Right. Well, it was controversial in that each of these ethnic peoples were like the black guy was eating watermelon, the Jew was eating a bagel, the Catholic was eating mackerel out of a can, and the Japanese was eating rice with chopsticks. And but that wasn't so controversial as was the fact that they were eating off of an American flag, which just wasn't treated that way back then. And it raised a big stink for a while. But then it wasn't too long after that. This was 1961. It was only like maybe 3 or 4 years later, when pop art was in full swing, that everybody began using flags. And I think Jasper Johns did some beautiful flag paintings. And it's always been a popular theme among artists.
Yeah, the story of this particular American flag, as Jerry tells it, is that he went to a secondhand store, an antique store, and the owner had flags with 48 stars. And of course, at that point, Alaska and Hawaii had been admitted, so the flags with 48 stars were no longer useful. They'd all been decommissioned. And so he said, he was looking for something, and the American flag he thought was perfect, for the tablecloth. And so he asked the woman how much she wanted for it, and she said $10. And of course, this is 1961. And he said, $10, you got to be crazy. This is a flag with 48 stars. What are you going to do with it? And so he said, no, thank you, and left. And he got about a block down, and the woman came running after him with the flag waving in her arm, saying, oh, my lights went up, saying, oh, okay, I'll sell it to you for $1.50. And so Jerry was able to talk her down. I'm going to wave my arms and get my lights back on. So Paul, if you want to say something fun.
Okay. Well, I always loved this photograph. Gosh, and I love the fact that they're all looking directly at the camera, and it was Mac's photograph, and so they're all looking at Mac, and I bet he was having a good time with it too. I'd love to see the proof sheet from this session, because this is the one he chose, but I wonder what the other things looked like too.
That's a good question. I need to ask him if he still has the proof sheet. I'm almost positive he does.
And I believe the format was 2 1/4. I think that's what Jerry was shooting then.
Yeah, but this was, this is an incredibly provocative image. Even in 1961, but I think it remains so. It's very edgy because of the way the artists have exploited these racial stereotypes. And all the artists are living, I believe, still.
Yes, I believe so too.
Yeah.
That's great.
So anyway, very interesting image. And really, I think, even though Jerry is not often given credit for this image, I think it remains one of his best known works.
Oh yeah, it should be. I'm pretty sure he's who set it up. But
he did. Yeah.
Well, then it is his photograph.
Oh, it is definitely his photograph. And it was, interestingly also, initially it wasn't on the checklist. And Jerry convinced me that, this was a key collaboration between he and Joe, as well as the other three artists included. And he really insisted that it was one of his best known works. It was an important work in the context of contemporary LA art history, and it really needed to be in the show. And, who was I to say no to him?
Great.
Well, from War Babies, we're going to move on to the work by one of the works by Ed Ruscha in the exhibition, the Insects portfolio. And there you see all 6 of the Insects portfolio together. What you don't see in this photograph is the cover, and we want to talk about the cover as well. But there's one of the prints, Black Ants. I should say that the portfolio emerged initially from an infestation of cockroaches that Ed had in his studio, but it really sort of morphed to something more than that. And it's really a fantastic suite that I think has some interesting connections to both Los Angeles and to Oklahoma. Paul, in fact, helped to create this piece and probably has one of the most interesting stories about its fabrication.
It was just the way I helped was that I was still living in Oklahoma City in 1972, and Ed called me and said that he'd like to pay me to go to our grade school where we had gone to elementary school, which was Hawthorne Grade School, and take a bucket with me and collect dirt from the playground and then mail it to him, which I did. And then it became the cover of this portfolio of these six insects, and and it almost acts like an Etch-a-Sketch, because when you hold the portfolio up, all the dirt runs down and it sort of clings to the linen on, and it's covered with plastic, so you can see it happening. And anyway, that was fun. But I love these insects because there are 3 of the prints are on it's a wood veneered paper, and then there's another one that is pearl dust combination, and I think pearls were crushed and run, as probably before Ed ran his insects over it, but that's this one here, and it makes it a beautiful sort of luminescent image.
And it's interesting to point out that your brother had always experimented, or at least was in the midst of experimenting with non-traditional materials at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And so using pearl dust, using a kind of wood veneer paper, was really part of his practice.
That's right.
We
graduated to stains.
Using different foodstuffs, using gunpowder.
Right.
And one of the gunpowder drawings is in the exhibition, the generous loan of Don Bacardi, who's an important artist in his own right.
Right. He's a portrait artist. And I believe he probably traded Ed a portrait for that work, which is the word Oklahoma, only it's OKLA period. And it's a gunpowder drawing. And Ed used to crush up the gunpowder and then use it instead of graphite as his medium of application, and it made it fairly rich. I think it has a richer look than graphite.
Yeah, they're really luscious drawings. They're more so than graphite or charcoal, and I think Ed probably. I remember him saying that it had. It just had a kind of nice velvety texture that he really enjoyed.
Right. Is there an image of that?
We don't have that in the presentation.
Oh, okay.
So people will have to come to the exhibit to see it.
How about when we're zooming around?
I also want to point out that not only is this piece in the exhibition, but it's part of the museum's collection, thanks to the generosity of Paul. This was in his collection for years and years, and he thought an appropriate home for it would be the Fred Jones Jr. Museum of Art, and I couldn't agree more.
Nor could I.
Paul, you had mentioned that Ed had made the comment that the insects had 5 o'clock shadows.
Yes, I like that about them. They do. And a 5
It's a very
o'clock
Trump
shadow,
way
of course, is how men were not supposed to have 5 o'clock shadows a long time ago. If you did, you know, your wife wouldn't want to kiss you when you came home from work. But Ed gave all these insects 5 o'clock shadows because their little shadows go down to 5 o'clock. Oh, that's a nice one. That's called Swarm of Red Ants.
And
Can
once Paul,
be seen, Mark?
I'm sorry, say that again?
The titles at the bottom of each one?
Yeah, this one is a swarm of red ants.
Oh, good. Yeah, that's good.
And once you mentioned that it was a 5 o'clock shadow, now I notice it, and I had never noticed that before, that all of the shadows point to the 5 o'clock
Right.
on a traditional.
Sure, that was a one of Ed's visual puns.
Yeah. Yeah, it's part of the subtle sense of humor that is in Ed's work, and I think in a lot of the show. And that's something that we'll talk about here a little bit in a second in greater detail. But one of the objectives of the exhibition was to inject a good dose of humor because all of the artists have a good sense of humor in this exhibition. Mason Williams probably most famously because he was the head writer for the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour, but has been a comedy writer for much of his career. But even though he sort of made his living in comedy, many of the other artists in this show also have a really good sense of humor. And to that end, that's a great transition to our next work, which is by Paul. And this is Dinner for Donald, which dates from 2020. And it is only fitting that Paul tell you all about it.
This was a work that I had first shown at the Contemporary Arts Foundation, where I had a studio from 1969 to 1973. And my first exhibition was of something that was very familiar to me at the time, and that was that I was the host at Christopher's Restaurant, which was a very popular restaurant in Oklahoma City. And the owner and proprietor there was Larry Wood. And Larry helped me acquire all these toilets and surround this table with, elegant china and silverware and flowers and such. And at the time it was called Dinner for Doris, and it was for Doris Day, and her dinner partner was Charles Manson, because he had gone after her son, Terry Melcher, when he sent those people in there to murder all those other people. And that was, a horrible miss. It was the end of Flower Children, period. But the other diners at this table were Maria Callas and Jackie Kennedy, who were at odds with one another because of Aristotle Onassis. And then there was Andy Warhol and Valerie Solanas, who had tried to murder him. She shot him. And then the last two were Eldridge Cleaver and Lester Maddox. And one was like a black activist, and the other was a white supremacist, more or less. And anyway, then the second resurrection of this work was in 2005, and it was called Dinner for W. And it was George W. Bush, and he had, there was a series of other people who were at odds with one another in the news. And finally, this came about because I wanted to do one for Donald Trump. And so this is called Dinner for Donald. And these were people, there's Donald on your left, and Nancy Pelosi. You'll notice that Donald's name is in red for red states, and Nancy's is in blue for blue states. And then the other diners are Jimmy Kimmel and Bill Maher, who are both they are merciless with their attacks on Donald Trump, and and then Kellyanne Conway was replaced when she quit by Stormy Daniels, whose place card was in red and blue because she'd slept with Trump, and she was also sort of pro blue, and then Hillary Clinton, of course, is I think she's to the left of Donald Trump, and I think that was everybody in this one.
You had Bill Maher.
Yes, Bill Maher. Oh, sorry, Mitch McConnell.
Mitch McConnell.
Yeah, that was everybody. Oh, and then my girlfriend of many years, Eve Babbitts. She's sitting to the right of Donald Trump, and she used to be pretty. I mean, she was pretty liberal, but then suddenly, last year, she started getting really pro-Trump, and I haven't been able to talk to her for a year, and unfortunately, but I think she's lost her mind. However, that's for her to know and for me to find out.
Well, there's a recent book on Eve Babbitts that I started reading, and then got busy and wasn't able to continue it. So I do need to finish that. But
you missed my chapter.
Actually, I did get through your chapter.
Oh, okay.
And that was when I had to put it down. But I think it would be fair to say that that Eve was something of a L.A. paramour, maybe.
Yeah, she was the biggest groupie. And she was a really good artist too. And she had a wonderful correspondence with with not Bruce Conner, but who's the guy that did those wonderful boxes? Oh gosh,
Joseph Cornell?
Yeah, and up till he died. And she herself made boxes that were not unlike some of the Cornell boxes. And so she had done album covers like, for Buffalo Springfield and some of the early guys. And she was also a squeeze of Jim Morrison of the Doors. And so she was right there in the thick of things. And she had been a girlfriend of my brother's also back in '65, I think it was. And then later on, when I met her in '73, we connected at that time and then for several years. But I didn't marry her. Anyway, that's that tale.
Well, there's a lot more there to say, but maybe people should buy the book.
Yeah, the book is Hollywood's Eve. That's the name of it. These are great.
Well, and speaking of humor, I think the next stop on the short video tour through OKLA is Mason Williams' pieces, Not a Mandrill Hole and Not a Clown Hole, although I read those backwards. Also from the collection of Paul Ruscha. And I did mention earlier on that, Mason is not so well known as an artist, but certainly has had a major impact on popular culture in the United States, not only as a comedy writer, but also as a musician. He is still, or has been up until recently, an active folk and bluegrass musician. He won an Emmy, a Grammy, for his...
Several Grammys.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, he won several Grammys.
Yeah, but one, probably the one that he's best known for is his now iconic work, Classical Gas,
right?
Which you still hear, I think, pretty frequently on certain radio stations. So Mason, however, has dabbled a lot, especially in terms of found objects, and absurdity and humor is, I think, inescapably a part of everything he creates. But Paul, you want to talk about these pieces in a little bit more detail?
Yeah, I mean, I saw these. Mason had collected these 2 planks of wood, and they were just so funny. I mean, he saw how elated I was by them, and he gave them to me. And actually, I don't think he had titled them that, but I said, God, look at that. That looks like a clown on the left and a mandrill on the right. And so he was amused by that, and he sort of let them take those names. And anyway, I've always loved these things. They're really beautiful surface. I love the surface on these. They almost look like velvet or satin.
And that's the interesting contrast in these pieces, is that on one hand, the materials do have this sort of wonderful aesthetic quality, but this is also what one would call anti-art, because, you know, he didn't do anything to create this. This is a creation of nature.
Mm-hmm.
And so it really sort of resists the traditional notion of art as something that one crafts through skill, through technique. I mean, essentially, he found these and gave them a conceptual cloaking that would provide some sort of meaning. But even to that end, Paul, you were the one that really kind of gave them their ultimate meaning, or at least their current meaning.
Well, you know, Mason hadn't said anything about that, but, you know, he always had a way of looking at things that was extremely artistic. And I always loved that about him and his work. Even his poetry, you know, he did books of poetry that were they were a riot. They were so funny and wonderful. And anyhow, I love these two works.
Well, Mason's always been very fond of the art movement known as Dada.
Yes.
And did some homages to Dada throughout his career, whether in verse or in physical form like this. And one of the stories he told me when I had the pleasure to meet him was that he and Ed used to go on Dada dates. And the idea was that, you know, the date would be demonstrably absurd. And to his memory, at one point he had a date with who he thought he remembered being Connie Stevens, the actress. And of course, she had dressed up as one would normally do on a date. But the date wound up being up in a tree. And so in her nice dress and stockings, she had to climb up this tree to have a picnic lunch with Mason on the limb. Yep. He does not remember ever getting a second date out of that one.
He was always very challenging. His dating habits. Okay.
Well, that brings us to our question and answer. So I think Hadley's going to come back in and help field some of the questions for Paul or I, or both of us.
Yes, I will. And all of the participants, if you would like to add a question, please feel free to continue asking questions and we will add those to the list. So first of all, we have a question from Lizanne Williams who asks, why was Patrick into drawing matchbooks and matches? Was there some significance to that? And I know Patrick might actually be one of the attendees. So if he'd like to respond, that would be great. But I think that if you know something about this, Paul and Mark, you could also comment.
I would like to, but I don't know that I could answer that. It'd be wonderful if Pat was in there.
Based on my conversations with Pat, I don't know that it was a matchbook in particular. He probably found some visual interest. One of the other images in the show that he and I did talk a little bit more about was, there go my lights again, was a image of dirt, a nice kind of square patch of dirt. And I asked Pat, you know, was there any meaning behind it? And he said, I just wanted to create a picture of dirt. And so often I think for Pat, it was just part of the experience, what it was that occurred to him. And he probably had a matchbook. He liked the way that it looked. And then he decided to create an engaging composition out of it.
That's right.
Well, I think if Patrick wants to, well, if he comments from here on out, we'll be sure and read that in the chat. But moving on, Lizanne also asks about Joe Goode's series of tornadoes. How many are in this series? And I'm curious, is he still making them?
No, Joe is not creating any more from that series. There are a lot of them. So there's a portfolio of prints, which
Beautiful.
which is fantastic, and actually was part of a gift that Ed and Dana Ruscha made to the museum a couple of years ago. But I know that as far as the drawings, the ink drawings, they number in the hundreds, and the paintings, I don't know how many of those there are, but based on what I've seen, there must be somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 30 of the paintings. But that's a good question, and something that I'd have to ask Joe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Paul, Erin Torres says she was on hand for the first dinner for Doris, and she can only remember JFK and Marilyn Monroe. Who else was at the table? This is Erin Torres or Pat Smiley. I'm not quite sure.
Oh, yeah. Pat Smiley was married to my best friend.
Okay.
And if Marilyn and Jack were in there, they must have been replacements. I think sometimes I would do that, where I would replace initial. I think they might have actually were replaced by Valerie Solanas and Andy Warhol. But yeah, thanks for reminding me of that, Pat.
Well, I'm curious, are there any replacements you would make to the dinner for Donald already, or?
Well, I've already done that. And I had Joe Biden sort of in the background waiting for somebody to drop out. But I did replace Kellyanne Conway with Stormy Daniels. So that's the only replacement so far.
Okay. Here's another question about from Lizanne. Why didn't Jerry get credit for War Babies? Was it shared credit? What happened with that?
It was just one of those situations where it was a poster for an exhibition. So as an advertisement, Jerry didn't put his name on it, but that was actually something that happened to Jerry a lot. Jerry has never really sought the limelight, and in some cases to the detriment of his career. He shot a number of artists in the LA scene in the early 70s, and often those images would get reproduced without Jerry's name being on it, and he never really pursued it or took it that seriously at the time. And the result was that Jerry is not as well remembered as he certainly should be, because in many ways, I think he was one of the key photographers working in the art scene in Los Angeles in the 1970s, and numerous images that he produced, I think now remain iconic, whether it's of Ed or Judy Chicago or Larry Bell. These are images that are still identified with these artists.
Mm-hmm. That's right. He was great. He did that great, it was like an announcement for a show that Judy Chicago did. I think it was right about the time she changed her name to Judy Chicago. And she was wearing boxing gloves and was in a ring, like a boxing ring. And I think, if I recall correctly, the guy who owned the rink, who was like a boxing manager, he was pissed off because they started to shoot this group of people, Judy's, handlers, in front of the rink, and so he said, no, you can't do it. And so they started to pack up and go away. But then they somehow ended up where he asked them in to shoot in the rink. And so that's where she was inside the rink. And they finished it there. And then later on, I think the guy was murdered, the owner. So it's
Yeah.
mafia dealing.
Jerry tells a great story about all of that in the catalog. And so when that's available, there is an interview that I did with Jerry, Joe, and Ed.
Mhm.
And Jerry tells that story. And yeah, Ed made the comment that they found the owner in the trunk of his car on like the Santa Monica freeway or something like that.
That's right.
So he got mixed up with the wrong people. But there's a great story about that. And I actually just had the opportunity to meet Judy Chicago not that long ago, and we talked about that story. So it's
a good
it's
story
very,
about her, but it's
very
not
memorable one where they're both concerned.
I actually have I have a message that Patrick is actually able to speak. Patrick, can you talk?
Oh,
Oh, are you there?
Yeah.
Oh,
hey,
Hi, Pat.
hi, Pat.
Hey, hi, Mark. How you doing? Good to see you.
Oh, God, I
Hi,
wish
Mark.
we could see you, Pat.
No, you don't want to do that.
Pat, would you like to comment on the matches?
I just love what they are, you know.
Me too.
Just the back of a matchbook is just such a interesting thing. You know, how you can ignite a whole forest with one match.
Right.
You know, it's amazing. It's such a threatening thing. It's such an attractive thing, I thought.
Right. You're right.
Thank you.
Well, it's wonderful to hear from you, Pat. I'm so glad you were able to sign on to this, and
Yeah, hi, Mark.
the work looks great.
Sure does.
Hi, Paul.
Hey, Pat. I was sorry that they weren't able to include that Dolly Parton like nude that you did, which Ed still owns. That was so
Yeah.
good.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite things.
Mine too.
Well,
Long
you can
women.
both blame that one on me.
And it certainly was when I was a teenager. It gave me a lot of impetus to malign myself. Sorry.
Well, we have another question. Paul, could you talk about, and Pat, please don't go anywhere.
Yeah.
No.
About the Publishers Clearinghouse connection, a little bit about that.
That's right. I was inundated for years. It seemed like many years. I moved to the Valley in 1989 and have been there ever since. So it's like 31 years. But for the first probably 10 years, every week I would get 2 or 3 different things that would say, you know, Paul Ruscha has won $10 million. And, you know, they were these publisher clearinghouse things that would come on. And I can't believe that, you know, so many of those things went out and so many people must have been duped into believing they'd won things like that. There's actually a great movie called Nebraska, and it's about that. This guy who wants to collect his money from one of these things. But I started collecting those just because it was so funny to see your name written so huge and, you know, trying to appeal to you, to your vanity. And so I saved them and then I put them on that plank and then called it The Loser because I never did collect any of the money from that stuff. And so I just, I called it The Loser. And so I lost. Anyway.
But it's going to be your loss and our gain, I think, for the museum.
Yeah, that's right. I gave it to the museum.
Well, here's a question from Nicole Poole, which I think is a great question for both you and Pat. She says, thank you for this beautiful exhibit and great conversation. How would you summarize the voice of Oklahomans as distinct from those of their LA counterparts at the time?
Of who? Uncle?
How would you summarize or characterize the voice of Oklahomans working in LA, you know, when you went out there as distinct from those of
Right. Well, I really think we're Okies at heart. And, you know, we have that connection through the Dust Bowl and, you know, being blown out of the state. And artists were always kind of, you know, rebels and not exactly welcome to stick around Oklahoma, but those that did, I find quite courageous. And the ones who left and then were able to sustain themselves for their careers out of state, I thought that was quite commendable. But I will always be an Okie and proud of it.
Well, this is kind of a related question, and I think Pat could maybe weigh in too. How did the group make the transition from Oklahoma to Los Angeles? Did you all go together? Did you follow one another? What was that like?
Well, it was kind of, I was originally from Los Angeles,
Mm-hmm.
and I was born there and moved to Oklahoma City. And it was just a unique thing to meet up with Ed, Mac, and Joe in art school together. And just a remarkable thing. And we always had great affection for each other and respect.
Yeah, you were part of the Students 5.
Yeah.
That was great.
We had great love for each other, and we still do.
Yeah, and you all lived at 1818 North New Hampshire Avenue in Hollywood.
That's right. Yes, 1818.
And you had a rooster named Ross.
Yes, right.
A lot for his-
That was Ed's rooster.
Now, was that Ed's rooster?
I don't
Yeah.
know which it was. I think they just all sort of looked after it.
And I had a standard poodle named Cha-Cha
Oh,
that was given to me by that time my girlfriend, Paula, and Paula Powers. And I don't know what I was doing with that big dog in the house all the time.
Well, it's worth noting that Pat arrived at the Chouinard Art Institute independent of Ed, Joe, and Jerry.
Yeah,
Because at the time that you didn't know each other.
right.
that's correct. Yes, we didn't. No.
And then found out that you were all from Oklahoma and decided to throw in together in one dilapidated house.
Yes, that's right. And we had another friend there, Don Moore, who was also
Right.
from Oklahoma City. And he and I had driven out to the West Chouinard in his car, and
Mm-hmm.
originally, yeah.
And
Yeah,
Walt
I heard
Batterton
you
was
do.
part of the group too for a while.
I
Was
always
that-
thought that Pat was the most sophisticated of all the guys in the Students 5. You just seemed to be like more East Coast, and it was ironic to me that you ended up on the East Coast.
Yes. Well, that was
Sophisticated guy.
initiated by a former wife.
Mhm, I remember that. Her, Gary.
Yeah. And that's what got me to the East Coast. I was perfectly happy in LA.
Really?
But, it's kind of an adventure to come to New York when you're young, see what it's like.
I remember you had the most beautiful daughter ever, Anastasia. She just was, she was a knockout.
Yeah, she still is.
I bet she is. Has to
She
be.
lives nearby. I see her frequently.
Oh, that's great.
And that's really great.
Oh, wonderful.
Well, here's kind of a funny question for you. How did Ross and Cha-Cha get along?
Imagine he didn't like the crowing.
I seem to be compatible.
Well, a serious question. Did you all see yourselves as part of pop art? This is from Catherine Ware. Or was your irreverence and humor and interest in consumer materials something unique to your own group? I can read that again. Did you see yourselves as part of pop art, or was your irreverence, humor, and interest in consumer materials something that was unique to your own group culture?
Yeah, when they started out, I don't believe they were, they even had the idea of being pop artists.
Mhm.
Certainly not in the early, like 60 years ago. It was not called pop art, and it wasn't called that until right after the Common Objects show in the Pasadena Art Museum in 60.
Yeah.
But
Pat, did you see your art as being akin to pop art or not?
No, I had no, it was just making pictures. I had no definition. It wasn't called, I didn't think of it as pop art at all. No, not when I started.
Well, and I would say that Joe would be in complete agreement with you. I don't think Joe sees his work as having a connection to pop art. But I think to Kate's question, and hi, Kate, I think that the irreverence and non-traditional materials and so on, I mean, I think part of that just came out of your personalities. I think there was a sort of shared sensibility among you that to some degree came out of your schooling in Oklahoma. But I think, you all have such fun, interesting personalities and such a non-traditional take on things that I think that's kind of how some of that stuff emerged. That's just my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good.
Here's a question about the influence of Robert Irwin on Ed, Joe, and Patrick at Chouinard. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, he was like a friend
Mm-hmm.
of us. And I he really introduced me to surfing, though I'd never done any surfing. And I have a son that is a very avid surfer today. And I thought him really an interesting figure at Chouinard, one we could really relate to. He spent a lot of time with us, the four of us, and he became just like a partner in our efforts. We really admired him very much, still do.
Yeah, he's still in there, a viable artist.
Oh, go ahead, Mark. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, and I know that Joe would second Pat's comments. I mean, Joe really saw Bob Irwin not as their teacher, but as part of their group. One of their friends.
That's right. That's right. He's not that much older than us, really.
There's a thing, Hadley, at the bottom here, which says that it is Alexandra Blackwell. That's not Anastasia, is it?
She says, Pat, she can't tell how her name appears, but she says she's your granddaughter, Alexandra.
I see.
Yeah, she is a
granddaughter.
Right?
Oh, that's great.
So that's
Alexandra. I just saw her recently. She was visiting here with her boyfriend John, and so we keep in touch. She's really good about that.
She just
she and her brother Hunter.
Yeah, she just went online with her comments in a chat room format.
Ah, really? Oh, good. Yeah. Well, I love those grandchildren. She and her twin brother Hunter are just extraordinary people, and parents did a good job with them. Boy.
I have a few more questions it looks like have come through. First of all, I think this is kind of related to what we're talking about right now. It appears you all are still close. I mean, you are still close, even though you're somewhat far apart.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see each other from time to time?
Gosh, I haven't had in 40 years, I guess. But, you know, I love hearing about him.
Well, yeah, we certainly do that. We, follow each other and
Mm-hmm.
try to catch up with. When I'm in LA, I try to. I saw Joe and his wife Romy, and I catch up with Ed when I'm there. It's always a great pleasure to see these guys and
That's
be
great.
in touch with them. And Mac, I'm frequently on the phone with Jerry McMillan. He's a long, intimate friend, and we talk about our families and whatnot.
He's a phoner, and you can't get off the phone when you're on with Matt.
Yeah, right. I know. That's true. He's such a talker. Oh, God.
He is a talker.
I have experience with that as well. You talk to Mason quite a bit too, right, Pat?
No, I haven't spoken to Mason in years. No.
Oh, okay.
No, I haven't. It's been a long time since I saw him and saw him perform and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
Here, I just have two more questions, I think, and then maybe we can wrap up the Q&A. First of all, could you talk a little bit about the group's filmmaking efforts? This is a question from Byron Price.
Which film?
Your collaborations, perhaps, in general.
Well, I just observed. I didn't have anything really to do with the filmmaking, but it was interesting seeing how Ed shot his films, and he got a Guggenheim grant to do his first film, and or maybe it was the second, but it's hard work. Good heavens, it's really hard work, and that was film, with big heavy cameras and that sort of thing. It's not just like a little digital thing that you can do nowadays, and have roughly the same sort of effect. But yeah, should I tell the story about the coffee pot? No, I won't.
Well, and Pat shot a lot of the photography for Mason's books.
Yes, he did.
Yeah.
Right.
And there was Crackers.
And Crackers and Royal Road Test.
Yeah.
And The Night I Lost My Baby too.
Right, that's right.
Yeah. That was coming back to LA from Las Vegas when we stopped and shot Royal Road Test. And threw the typewriter out the window, and we decided to go back and see what happened. And we photographed it. That became Royal Road Test.
Pat, was it just a fluke that Ed decided to throw the typewriter out the window?
I'm not certain of that. It just, maybe it was, And then we drove on, and we thought, gee, I wonder what it looks like. So we turned around and came back.
Have you seen that movie, Pat? That came out recently called American Typewriter?
Yes, I have
That's
seen
good.
that.
That's a really good movie.
Yes, it is. I enjoyed that very much.
It was certainly, it must have been a resurgence for the manual typewriter world. They had all these.
Yeah, and the film, the one I saw, they had the prelude was all Royal Road Test. About that.
Yes, that's right. They
Yeah.
introduced it via Royal Road Test.
Right.
Pat, we have a question for you from Elizabeth Wise. She asks if New York changed anything about your approach to your work.
I don't think so, really. When I was in New York, I worked in an advertising agency. I wasn't that productive making art. And it was kind of, I didn't get back into that until I was left New York, really. And I did a lot of illustration, editorial illustration. I did that for a number of years when I moved back to Massachusetts. That was really a lot of fun because you could do anything you wanted. You were just given a theme, and they loved your work, so you could just do whatever. You know, it was great way to work.
Yeah. Pat, you'd really love the show. You've got some really great representative work in this show. I think I really wish you could see it. It's great.
Yeah, me too.
Well, as soon as the catalog's finished, you'll certainly get a couple of copies in the mail.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Oh, at least 3.
3, you got it.
I gotta cover family members and stuff, you know.
Sure.
They're all anxiously waiting.
Paul, we have, it looks like 2 last questions
Okay.
for you. One is, have you given any thought about future dinners for your dinner series? And I'll save the
Good
last
question. There's no end to it as long as they start with a D. To alliterations in a big way. And there was Doris, and then W, and now Donald. And so, gosh, who knows?
Ooh.
And then the other question, well, but please feel free to continue, is what's your favorite work in the show, or what would you say about the show having come out and seen it?
Who is this a question for?
For you.
Oh, for me. Oh, favorite work in the show. Boy, it's hard to play favorites with this show. I mean, I've known these guys work for 60 years or more, and I can tell you what I love in each of the guys' works.
Okay.
But as I said, I love the painting of Ed's, which is called No Man's Land, and that is in the collection of the Fred Jones, and that's just it's a silhouette of the shape of the state of Oklahoma with a huge question mark that runs from upper left to lower, upper right to lower left. And that's my favorite, I think, in this show of Ed's. And then of Pat's, I love that photograph of the dirt. I just think that's wonderful. It's so abstract and it's just wonderful. And Max, I like that copper. I've always loved that copper landscape of his. And so I'd say that's probably my favorite of his. And then Joe's, the tornado drawing, I think is my favorite in that. Were there other? Oh yeah, and Mason. And Mason's are the 2 planks of wood because they are so Dada, and so is Mason's head, and so that's it. And then my own work, I think I like the loser probably the best. I'm so familiar with the table setting, but I like the loser, and I love the way it's shown. It wasn't given that. It was shown once before at Bergamot Station in a gallery there, but it didn't have nearly maybe its prominence, or it was probably the lighting that it has in the Fred Jones exhibition. So I'd have to say that's my favorite of my own stuff. So, but I see now there's like 35 messages down at the bottom. Hadley, are you holding out on us?
Oh no, we've been reading them.
Not that I want to be here till midnight.
No, in fact, I think we'll probably wrap it up.
Okay.
I want to thank everybody on behalf of the Junior Museum of Art for attending, especially for our panelists, Mark and Paul and Patrick. It was a real treat to have you join us as well.
Loved it, Pat.
Hey, it's really nice to be here.
Thank you.
And all of your family. It looks like so many of your family members have joined in, which is a real an honor for us.
Yeah.
Thank you, Hadley.
Great to hear your voice, Pat. Hope to see you soon.
Yeah.
Hey, hi, Mark.
I would encourage all of you who are attending to continue to check the events page on the museum's website, where we will post future Zoom programming. And we hope you all will have a chance to visit OKLA, which will be on view in the Records Gallery through March 7th. So it's up until March. So please come and see it. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Mark.